Montgomery, Alabama, March 2nd, 1955. A 15-year-old black girl sits rigid in her seat on a crowded city bus. Her hands grip the metal bar in front of her, white knuckles, trembling fingers. The bus driver's voice cuts through the afternoon air like a blade. "I said move." She doesn't move. Around her, the other black passengers are already standing, already moving to the back, already obeying. But not her. She stays frozen in her seat, her school books pressed against her chest like a shield. "Did you hear me, girl?" Her voice comes out barely above a whisper, but every word lands like thunder. "It's my constitutional right to sit here." The driver's face turns red, his hand reaches for something. The other passengers hold their breath. In this moment, one teenager is about to trigger a chain of events that will shake the foundations of American segregation. Her name is Claudette Colvin, and you've probably never heard of her. Here's what they never told you. 9 months before Rosa Parks became the face of the Montgomery bus boycott, this 15-year-old girl did the exact same thing. She refused to give up her seat. She got arrested. She went to jail. She fought the case all the way to the Supreme Court. And she won. But her name was erased from every textbook. Her story was buried. Her courage was forgotten. And she's not alone. What you're about to discover will fundamentally change how you understand the civil rights movement, because the heroes you learned about in school, they were carefully selected, carefully sanitized, carefully presented to make you comfortable with a version of history that never existed. The real heroes, the ones who did the actual work, the ones who organized, strategized, and risked everything, they were erased. 5 names, 5 revolutionaries, 5 people who shaped America more than most presidents. And you don't know any of them. This is why. Harlem, New York, 1930s. A young black woman walks through the streets during the Great Depression. Everywhere she looks, she sees suffering, families evicted from their homes, children with empty stomachs, men who can't find work no matter how hard they try. But she also sees something else. Power. Not the power of presidents or politicians, not the power of money or influence. She sees the power that exists when ordinary people decide they've had enough, when they organize, when they fight back together. Her name is Ella Baker, and she's about to become the most important civil rights leader you've never heard of. Here's what makes Ella Baker's erasure so disturbing. She didn't just participate in the civil rights movement, she didn't just support it, she literally built the infrastructure that made it possible. Think about that for a second. Every major civil rights organization you've ever heard of, she either founded it, organized it, or shaped it into what it became. The NAACP, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Ella Baker was there at the beginning of all of them. But history books mention her name maybe once, maybe twice, usually in a footnote, usually as someone who helped the real leaders, who were of course all men. This part will make you angry. December 1955. Everyone knows what happened. Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat. The Montgomery bus boycott began. Martin Luther King Jr. became famous. But here's the part they don't teach. Who organized the boycott? Who created the infrastructure? Who went door to door convincing people to participate? Who set up the alternative transportation system? Who made sure people could get to work without using the buses? Not Rosa Parks, not Martin Luther King Jr. Women like Ella Baker and dozens of other black women whose names you'll never learn. Rosa Parks wasn't just a tired seamstress who spontaneously decided to sit down. That's the fairy tale version, the version that makes white people comfortable. the version that suggests the civil rights movement happened by accident. The truth? Rosa Parks was a trained activist. She had attended organizing workshops. She was secretary of the Montgomery NAACP, and her act of defiance was coordinated with other civil rights leaders who were waiting for the right moment, the right case, the right person to build a movement around. And who trained Rosa Parks? Ella Baker. 1960, Greensboro, North Carolina. 4 black college students sit down at a whites-only lunch counter. They order coffee. They're refused service. They don't leave. Within days, the sit-in movement spreads across the South like wildfire. Thousands of students join, dozens of cities, hundreds of lunch counters. It's spontaneous, it's powerful, it's young people taking control of their own destiny. But it's also chaos. These students need coordination, they need strategy, they need someone who understands how to turn rage into revolutionary action. They need Ella Baker. She's 57 years old at this point. She could retire. She could rest. She's already done more for civil rights than most people will do in 10 lifetimes. Instead, she does something that will change American history forever. She organizes a conference. She brings together hundreds of student activists from across the South, and she tells them something that no other civil rights leader is willing to say. Don't let anyone tell you what to do. Not me, not King, not anyone. You figure out what needs to be done, and you do it. This is revolutionary, because every other civil rights organization operates top-down. Charismatic male leaders tell everyone else what to do, make the decisions, take the credit. Ella Baker believes in something different. She believes in radical democracy. She believes the people most affected by injustice should be the ones leading the fight against it. She believes in developing leaders, not followers. So these students create their own organization, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC. And SNCC becomes the most radical, most effective, most fearless civil rights organization in America. They organize the Freedom Rides. They register black voters in the most dangerous parts of the South. They risk their lives every single day. And Ella Baker is the one who made it possible. Here's why Ella Baker's erasure is so disturbing. She didn't just participate in the civil rights movement, she didn't just support it, she literally built the infrastructure that made it possible. Think about that for a second. Every major civil rights organization you've ever heard of, she either founded it, organized it, or shaped it into what it became. The NAACP, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Ella Baker was there at the beginning of all of them. But history books mention her name maybe once, maybe twice, usually in a footnote, usually as someone who helped the real leaders, who were of course all men. This part will make you angry. December 1955. Everyone knows what happened. Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat. The Montgomery bus boycott began. Martin Luther King Jr. became famous. But here's the part they don't teach. Who organized the boycott? Who created the infrastructure? Who went door to door convincing people to participate? Who set up the alternative transportation system? Who made sure people could get to work without using the buses? Not Rosa Parks, not Martin Luther King Jr. Women like Ella Baker and dozens of other black women whose names you'll never learn. Rosa Parks wasn't just a tired seamstress who spontaneously decided to sit down. That's the fairy tale version, the version that makes white people comfortable, the version that suggests the civil rights movement happened by accident. The truth? Rosa Parks was a trained activist. She had attended organizing workshops. She was secretary of the Montgomery NAACP, and her act of defiance was coordinated with other civil rights leaders who were waiting for the right moment, the right case, the right person to build a movement around. And who trained Rosa Parks? Ella Baker. 1960, Greensboro, North Carolina. 4 black college students sit down at a whites-only lunch counter. They order coffee. They're refused service. They don't leave. Within days, the sit-in movement spreads across the South like wildfire. Thousands of students join, dozens of cities, hundreds of lunch counters. It's spontaneous, it's powerful, it's young people taking control of their own destiny. But it's also chaos. These students need coordination, they need strategy, they need someone who understands how to turn rage into revolutionary action. They need Ella Baker. She's 57 years old at this point. She could retire. She could rest. She's already done more for civil rights than most people will do in 10 lifetimes. Instead, she does something that will change American history forever. She organizes a conference. She brings together hundreds of student activists from across the South. And she tells them something that no other civil rights leader is willing to say. Don't let anyone tell you what to do. Not me, not King, not anyone. You figure out what needs to be done, and you do it. This is revolutionary, because every other civil rights organization operates top-down. Charismatic male leaders tell everyone else what to do, make the decisions, take the credit. Ella Baker believes in something different. She believes in radical democracy. She believes the people most affected by injustice should be the ones leading the fight against it. She believes in developing leaders, not followers. So these students create their own organization, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC. And SNCC becomes the most radical, most effective, most fearless civil rights organization in America. They organize the Freedom Rides. They register black voters in the most dangerous parts of the South. They risk their lives every single day. And Ella Baker is the one who made it possible. Here's why Ella Baker's story was erased. She didn't believe in charismatic leaders. She didn't believe in waiting for a savior. She didn't believe in asking permission from white people to be treated like human beings. She believed in radical, decentralized, democratic organizing. She believed ordinary people could change the world. And that philosophy, that terrified everyone in power. Because you can kill a Martin Luther King Jr., you can arrest a Malcolm X, you can silence a charismatic leader. But how do you stop a movement where everyone is a leader, where the people themselves hold the power, where there's no single person to target, no figurehead to destroy? You can't. So instead, you erase that philosophy from history. You tell the story as if the civil rights movement was about great men giving great speeches. You make it about individuals instead of collective action. You make it about asking nicely instead of demanding justice. You turn revolution into a bedtime story. Ella Baker lived to be 83 years old. She died in 1986. By then, she'd spent more than 50 years fighting for justice, more than 50 years organizing, more than 50 years developing leaders who would change the world. And when she died, most Americans had never heard her name. Not because she wasn't important, but because her importance exposed the lie that history wants to tell. The lie that freedom is given by benevolent leaders. The lie that change comes from asking nicely. The lie that ordinary people need to wait for someone to save them. Ella Baker's entire life was proof that this lie is bullshit, and that's exactly why they erased her. August 28, 1963, Washington, D.C. More than 250,000 people have gathered at the Lincoln Memorial. It's the largest demonstration in American history, the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. Martin Luther King Jr. is about to give the most famous speech in American history, "I Have a Dream." But behind the scenes, chaos. Sound systems failing, speakers running long, tensions between different civil rights groups, the threat of violence from white supremacists, police everywhere, and one man is holding it all together. He's coordinating security, he's managing logistics, he's keeping the peace between feuding organizations, he's making sure everything runs perfectly. Because he's the one who planned this entire event. His name is Bayard Rustin, and history tried to destroy him. Here's what you need to understand about Bayard Rustin. He wasn't just at the March on Washington, he organized it. Every detail, every speech, every porta-potty, every bus route, every security protocol. The March on Washington is considered one of the greatest achievements of the civil rights movement, the moment that changed public opinion, the moment that made the Civil Rights Act of 1964 possible. And it was planned by a man whose name you don't know. Why? Because Bayard Rustin was gay, and in 1963, that was enough to destroy him. But Rustin's erasure goes deeper than just his sexuality. He was the one who taught Martin Luther King Jr. about nonviolent resistance. Read that again. The philosophy that defined the entire civil rights movement, the strategy of peaceful protest that King became famous for, that came from Bayard Rustin. In 1956, after the Montgomery bus boycott began, King was considering armed self-defense. He had guns in his house. He was prepared to fight violence with violence. Bayard Rustin traveled to Montgomery and spent weeks convincing King that nonviolent resistance was more powerful, more strategic, more revolutionary. King listened, and the rest is history. Except the history books don't mention Rustin's name. Here's a story that will blow your mind. 1941. World War II is raging. America needs workers for the war industry, but black workers are being excluded from defense jobs. A labor organizer named A. Philip Randolph has an idea. Threaten a massive march on Washington. Force President Roosevelt to integrate the defense industry. And who does he turn to plan this march? Bayard Rustin, who's only 29 years old at the time. They plan a march of 100,000 black Americans in 1941, in the middle of the war, when any mass gathering of black people terrified white America. Roosevelt panics. He issues Executive Order 8802, banning discrimination in defense industries. The march never happens, but the threat of it changed American policy. And Bayard Rustin was the architect. 22 years later, he'll use everything he learned to organize the 1963 March on Washington, but even bigger, even more perfect, even more powerful. 1960, 3 years before the March on Washington, Bayard Rustin is arrested in Pasadena, California. The charge? Lewd conduct. He was caught with another man. He's sentenced to 60 days in jail. His reputation is destroyed. Civil rights leaders panic. They distance themselves from him. They worry that association with a gay man will destroy the movement. They push him into the shadows. Martin Luther King Jr. is advised to cut ties with him completely. And Rustin accepts it. He understands the reality. He knows that in 1960s America, being gay is political suicide. He knows that his sexuality will be used to attack the entire civil rights movement. So he steps back. He works behind the scenes. He becomes invisible. But he never stops fighting. Summer of 1963. Civil rights leaders want to organize a march on Washington. Something big, something that will force the government to act on civil rights legislation. But nobody thinks it's possible. The logistics are too complex. The potential for violence is too high. The coordination between different civil rights groups is impossible. They all hate each other. They all have different agendas. They all want to be in charge. Someone suggests bringing in Bayard Rustin. Some leaders refuse. They don't want a gay man associated with the march. They think it will give ammunition to their enemies. A. Philip Randolph, the legendary labor leader, says this: "If Bayard doesn't organize it, I won't participate." That settles it. Rustin gets less than 2 months to plan the largest demonstration in American history. What Bayard Rustin accomplished in those 2 months is almost impossible to comprehend. He coordinated transportation for 250,000 people from all over the country. He organized 2,000 buses, 21 special trains, and multiple chartered flights. He set up first aid stations, sanitation facilities, and communication systems. He created a detailed minute-by-minute schedule for the entire event. He negotiated between civil rights groups that despised each other. He coordinated with the Kennedy administration, who were terrified the march would turn violent. He planned for every contingency. What if white supremacists attacked? What if police started arresting people? What if the sound system failed? What if it rained? He thought of everything. And on August 28, 1963, everything went perfectly. Not a single arrest, not a single incident of violence, not a single logistical failure. 250,000 people gathered peacefully, made their demands heard, and changed American history. And when Martin Luther King Jr. gave his I Have a Dream speech, Bayard Rustin stood in the background, making sure everything kept running smoothly. After the march, civil rights leaders gave interviews. They took credit. They basked in the glory. Bayard Rustin's name was barely mentioned. When the Civil Rights Act passed in 1964, he wasn't invited to the signing ceremony. When history books were written about the civil rights movement, his name appeared in footnotes, if at all. Why? Because acknowledging Bayard Rustin meant acknowledging that a gay man was one of the most important architects of the civil rights movement. And America in the 1960s, and honestly America today, wasn't ready for that truth. Bayard Rustin spent the rest of his life fighting for justice. In the 1970s and 1980s, when most civil rights leaders ignored the emerging gay rights movement, Rustin spoke out. He connected the struggle for racial justice with the struggle for LGBTQ rights. He said, "The barometer of where one is on human rights questions is no longer the black community, it's the gay community." He died in 1987. In 2013, President Obama posthumously awarded him the Presidential Medal of Freedom. But that was 26 years after his death, decades too late, and still most Americans don't know his name. Here's the truth they don't want you to know. The civil rights movement succeeded because of the work of people history tried to erase. Gay people, women, radicals, socialists, people who didn't fit the sanitized version of the story. Bayard Rustin was one of them, and his erasure wasn't an accident, it was a choice. Montgomery, Alabama, March 2, 1955. We're back to that moment. Claudette Colvin sits in her seat on that crowded bus. The driver is yelling, the other passengers are staring, police officers are being called. This 15-year-old girl knows what's about to happen. She knows they'll arrest her. She knows they'll hurt her. She knows her life will never be the same. But she doesn't move. The police arrive, 2 white officers. They grab her arms. They drag her off the bus. She's screaming. She's crying. She's fighting back. They throw her in the police car. They call her names. They threaten her. She's 15 years old. And in this moment, she's braver than most adults will ever be. Here's what happened next. Claudette Colvin was charged with violating segregation laws, disorderly conduct, and assaulting police officers. That last charge was a lie. She didn't assault anyone. But it didn't matter. She spent hours in jail, terrified, alone, 15 years old. But she didn't back down. When her case went to court, she testified. She argued that segregation laws were unconstitutional. She stood up to the system that wanted to crush her. And the black community of Montgomery watched. They saw this teenager do what most adults were too afraid to do. They started organizing, talking about a boycott, talking about resistance. But then the civil rights leaders made a decision. They decided not to build a movement around Claudette Colvin. Why? This is where the story gets painful. The NAACP and other civil rights organizations were looking for the perfect case to challenge segregation. They wanted someone who could be the face of the movement, someone respectable, someone who would gain sympathy from white moderates. Claudette Colvin didn't fit that image. She was 15, she was dark-skinned, she was from a poor family, and most damning of all, she got pregnant a few months after her arrest. Civil rights leaders decided she wasn't appropriate to be the symbol of the movement. Let that sink in. A 15-year-old girl had the courage to challenge the most violent, oppressive system in America. She risked her life, she went to jail, she stood up in court and fought. And civil rights leaders decided she wasn't good enough. 9 months later, December 1, 1955, Rosa Parks refuses to give up her seat on a Montgomery bus. She's arrested, and this time, civil rights leaders decide to act. Rosa Parks is 42 years old. She's light-skinned. She's married. She's the secretary of the local NAACP. She's respectable. She's perfect for the movement. The Montgomery bus boycott begins. It lasts 381 days. It becomes one of the most important events in civil rights history. Rosa Parks becomes an icon. And Claudette Colvin watches from the shadows. But here's the part that makes this story even more infuriating. The Montgomery bus boycott didn't actually end segregation on buses. The boycott was powerful, it was important, it mobilized the black community. But segregation on buses ended because of a Supreme Court case, Browder v. Gale. And one of the 4 plaintiffs in that case, the one who testified about being arrested for refusing to give up her seat, Claudette Colvin. She was 16 years old when she testified in federal court. She faced down lawyers trying to humiliate her. She told her story. She refused to back down. And the Supreme Court ruled in her favor. Segregation on buses was declared unconstitutional. Claudette Colvin won. But Rosa Parks got the credit. For decades, Claudette Colvin lived in obscurity. She moved to New York. She worked as a nurse's aide. She raised her children. She lived a quiet life. And nobody knew she had sparked the Montgomery bus boycott. Nobody knew she had been a plaintiff in the case that ended bus segregation. Nobody knew her name. In 2015, 50 years after her arrest, a writer named Philip Hoos interviewed her for a young adult book called Claudette Colvin, Twice Toward Justice. That's when her story finally started to come out. She was 66 years old. She had spent half a century in silence. Let's address the elephant in the room. Why did civil rights leaders choose Rosa Parks over Claudette Colvin? The official reasons were about respectability, about finding the right plaintiff, about strategy. But the uncomfortable truth, colorism played a role. Rosa Parks was light-skinned. Claudette Colvin was dark-skinned. In a movement fighting against white supremacy, leaders still internalized anti-blackness. They still believed that lighter skin would be more palatable to white people. This is the truth nobody wants to talk about. The civil rights movement, for all its righteousness, still operated within systems of oppression, still made decisions based on respectability politics, still sacrificed dark-skinned, poor, young black people for the sake of the right image. And Claudette Colvin paid the price. In interviews later in life, Claudette Colvin said this, "I knew then and I know now that when it comes to justice, there is no easy way to get it. You can't sugarcoat it. You have to take a stand and say this is not right." She also said, "History had me glued to the seat. Harriet Tubman's hands were pushing me down on one shoulder and Sojourner Truth's hands were pushing me down on the other shoulder. And about being erased from history, I felt like I was invisible, and I wondered why." In 2021, 66 years after her arrest, Claudette Colvin's juvenile record was finally expunged. She was 82 years old. For 66 years, she had a criminal record for refusing to give up her seat on a segregated bus. Think about that. The same act that made Rosa Parks a hero kept Claudette Colvin marked as a criminal for most of her life. When the judge finally cleared her record, Claudette said, "I'm no longer an underage offender for resisting segregation. The civil rights movement was supposed to be about equality, but I was never equal to Rosa Parks." Here's what Claudette Colvin's story teaches us. History doesn't actually remember the bravest people. It remembers the people who are deemed acceptable by those in power. The real heroes are often too young, too poor, too dark, too radical, too queer, too inappropriate to be honored. So they're erased, replaced, written out of the story. And a sanitized version of history gets taught to children who will never know the truth. Claudette Colvin should be as famous as Rosa Parks. She should be in every textbook. Every child in America should know her name. But they don't. And that's not an accident. Maryland, 1791. A black man sits at a table covered with astronomical instruments, telescopes, charts, mathematical calculations covering every surface. He's been awake for days, maybe weeks. He barely eats. He barely sleeps. He's doing something that everyone said was impossible. He's designing a city. Not just any city, the future capital of the United States, Washington, D.C. And he's doing it mostly from memory after the chief architect quit and took all the plans with him. His name is Benjamin Banneker, and he's about to prove something that white supremacists insist cannot be true. That a black intellectual genius not only exists, but can surpass that of white men. They'll spend the next 200 years trying to bury this truth. Benjamin Banneker was born in 1731 in Maryland. His grandmother was a formerly enslaved woman who had been brought from England. His grandfather was an enslaved African. Banneker was technically born free, but that meant almost nothing in colonial America. He attended a small Quaker school for a few years. That was his entire formal education. A few years in a one-room schoolhouse. Everything else? He taught himself. At 21, he built a wooden clock from scratch. He'd only seen a pocket watch once. He studied it for hours, memorized the gears, and then created a fully functional striking clock entirely from wood. That clock ran accurately for over 50 years. But that was just the beginning. In his 50s, Banneker borrowed some books on astronomy and mathematics from a neighbor. He stayed up all night reading them, night after night, month after month. He taught himself advanced mathematics, logarithms, trigonometry, astronomical calculations that most people with university educations couldn't do. And then he started making his own astronomical observations. He predicted eclipses. He calculated the positions of planets. He tracked the movements of stars. And he was accurate, incredibly accurate. In 1791, Banneker published the first of his almanacs. Banneker's almanac contained astronomical calculations, weather predictions, tide tables, and essays on various topics. Almanacs were incredibly important in the 18th century. Farmers used them to plan planting and harvesting. Sailors used them for navigation. Everyone relied on them. And Banneker's was as accurate as any published by white astronomers. Actually, it was often more accurate. 1791. President George Washington has commissioned Pierre-Charles L'Enfant, a French architect, to design the new capital city. L'Enfant is brilliant but temperamental. He fights with everyone. He refuses to follow orders. Washington fires him. And L'Enfant, in a fit of rage, takes all the plans with him, every map, every design, every calculation. The project is about to collapse, but there's one person who can save it. Benjamin Banneker had been working as the surveyor's assistant. He'd spent months studying L'Enfant's plans. He'd memorized them, every street, every building, every measurement. The officials are skeptical. This is a black man, a self-taught astronomer. Can he really recreate the plans for an entire city from memory? He can. Over the next few months, Banneker recreates L'Enfant's plans with incredible accuracy. He works from memory and from his own mathematical calculations. The layout of Washington, D.C., the capital of the United States, is largely the work of Benjamin Banneker, but history books barely mention his name. August 19, 1791. Benjamin Banneker does something audacious, something that could get him killed. He writes a letter to Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson, the author of the Declaration of Independence, the man who wrote "All men are created equal" while enslaving over 600 people throughout his lifetime. Banneker sends Jefferson a copy of his almanac, and he writes a letter that is one of the most devastating critiques of American hypocrisy ever written. The letter is brilliant, it's eloquent, it's devastating. Banneker quotes Jefferson's own words back to him. He points out the hypocrisy of declaring that all men are created equal while enslaving millions of black people. He writes, "Sir, how pitiable is it to reflect that although you were so fully convinced of the benevolence of the Father of mankind and of his equal and impartial distribution of these rights and privileges which he hath conferred upon them, that you should at the same time counteract his mercies in detaining by fraud and violence so numerous a part of my brethren under groaning captivity and cruel oppression." Translation? You talk about equality and freedom while you enslave my people. How can you live with yourself? Thomas Jefferson actually responds to Banneker's letter, and his response is revealing. He praises Banneker. He says Banneker's astronomical work is proof that black people are capable of intelligence. But here's the thing: Jefferson actually doesn't believe it. In private letters to other people, Jefferson suggests that Banneker must have had help from white people, that he couldn't possibly have done this work on his own. Jefferson writes to Joel Barlow, "We know he had spherical trigonometry enough to make almanacs, but not without the suspicion of aid from Ellicott, who was his neighbor and friend." In other words, I'll publicly praise this black man to seem reasonable, but privately I'll suggest he's a fraud. This is white supremacy in action. Even when confronted with undeniable proof of black genius, white people will find ways to discredit it. Banneker published his almanac every year from 1792 to 1797. These weren't just scientific documents, they were political statements. Banneker included essays against slavery. He published his letter to Jefferson. He used his platform to argue for abolition and racial equality. And he did it all through the authority of his scientific expertise. He was saying, "I can calculate the movement of stars, I can predict eclipses, I can design cities, and I'm black, so maybe your theories about racial inferiority are bullshit." Abolitionists loved his almanacs. They distributed them widely. They used Banneker as proof that slavery was morally and intellectually indefensible. Slaveholders hated him, and after his death, they worked very hard to erase his contributions to history. October 9, 1806, Benjamin Banneker dies at age 74. On the day of his funeral, something suspicious happens. His house catches fire. Almost all of his papers, manuscripts, astronomical calculations, and journals are destroyed. Some people said it was an accident, but many believe it was arson, that someone deliberately destroyed the evidence of his genius. Because if those papers had survived, they would have been undeniable proof that a black man in the 18th century had achieved scientific work that rivaled the best white astronomers in Europe. And that couldn't be allowed to stand. After Banneker's death, his contributions were systematically minimized. History books mentioned him briefly, if at all. When they did mention him, they downplayed his achievements. They suggested he had help from white people. They questioned whether he really did the work he claimed to do. His role in designing Washington, D.C., the capital of the United States, was nearly erased completely. For most of American history, if you asked someone who designed the nation's capital, they would say Pierre Charles L'Enfant. Banneker's name wouldn't come up. Here's why Benjamin Banneker was erased. His very existence destroyed the intellectual justification for slavery. Slavery depended on the myth that black people were intellectually inferior, that they were incapable of advanced thought, that they needed white people to take care of them. Benjamin Banneker proved that was a lie. A self-taught black man with barely any formal education had mastered astronomy, mathematics, and engineering. He had published scientific work. He had designed a capital city. He had debated with Thomas Jefferson as an intellectual equal. And he did it all during slavery. If people truly understood what Banneker accomplished, they would have to confront an uncomfortable truth: that enslaved black people weren't enslaved because they were inferior. They were enslaved because white people wanted free labor and were willing to use violence to get it. Banneker's genius made that truth unavoidable, so they erased him. In recent years, historians have worked to restore Benjamin Banneker's place in history. In 1980, the U.S. Postal Service issued a stamp in his honor. In Washington, D.C., there's now a park and a school named after him. But most Americans still don't know who he was. Ask a random person on the street who designed Washington, D.C., and they won't say Benjamin Banneker. Ask them to name a black scientist from the 18th century, and they'll draw a blank. The erasure continues. Washington, D.C., 1957. A black woman in her 50s walks into a Senate hearing room. She's carrying a briefcase full of documents, research, statistics, testimony from women across the country. She's about to testify before the Senate about something nobody wants to talk about: the specific ways that black women are discriminated against in America. Not just as black people, not just as women, but as black women, facing a unique form of oppression that nobody even has a name for yet. The senators look bored, they're barely listening, but this woman doesn't care. She speaks for hours, she presents evidence, she demands action. Her name is Dorothy Height, and for the next 50 years she'll be the most powerful woman in the civil rights movement that nobody talks about. Here's what makes Dorothy Height's erasure particularly egregious. She was there for everything. Every major civil rights event from the 1930s to the 2000s, she was there. She worked with Eleanor Roosevelt in the 1930s on anti-lynching campaigns. She was on the platform at the March on Washington in 1963, right there with Martin Luther King Jr. She organized voter registration drives during the 1960s. She fought for women's rights in the 1970s. She continued organizing well into the 2000s, working with Barack Obama's campaign. She knew everyone. She worked with everyone. She organized everything. And somehow, most people have never heard her name. 1929. Dorothy Height is 17 years old. She's brilliant, she's accomplished, she's won a national oratory competition. She has a scholarship to Barnard College in New York. She shows up on the first day of classes, excited to begin her education. And the admissions office tells her there's been a mistake. They've already met their quota of black students for the year. 2 black students, that's the limit. And Height makes 3. So despite having a scholarship, despite being academically qualified, despite having done everything right, she's turned away because she's black. She ends up attending New York University instead. She earns a bachelor's degree in 4 years and a master's degree in 1 additional year. But she never forgets that moment at Barnard. She never forgets what it feels like to be told you're not wanted, and it fuels everything she does for the rest of her life. Dorothy Height understood something that most civil rights leaders didn't want to acknowledge. Black women faced a unique form of oppression. In the civil rights movement, they were told to focus on race, to put aside issues of gender, to support the men who were leading the movement. In the women's movement, they were told to focus on gender, to put aside issues of race, to align with white women who often didn't care about racism. Black women were expected to choose. Dorothy Height refused. She insisted that you couldn't separate race and gender, that black women's liberation required fighting both racism and sexism simultaneously. This made her unpopular with both movements. Civil rights leaders thought she was being divisive. White feminists thought she was being difficult. She didn't care. In 1957, Dorothy Height became the president of the National Council of Negro Women. She would hold that position for 40 years. Under her leadership, the NCNW became one of the most powerful black women's organizations in America. They organized voter registration drives in the South. They created job training programs for black women. They fought for reproductive rights. They addressed issues like child care, health care, and economic justice. They did the unglamorous, essential work that made the civil rights movement possible. But when history books talk about the civil rights movement, they focus on the men giving speeches, not the women doing the organizing. August 28, 1963, the March on Washington. Dorothy Height is one of the organizers. She's on the platform with all the major civil rights leaders, but when it's time for the speeches, she's not invited to speak. None of the women are. The march is called the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, but the organizers don't think women's voices are important enough to include in the official program. Dorothy Height and other women leaders protest. They demand to be heard. The male leaders offer a compromise. One woman can speak, but only briefly and only as part of a tribute to women. That woman is Daisy Bates, who led the Little Rock 9 integration effort. She's given 6 minutes. Martin Luther King Jr. speaks for 16 minutes. Dorothy Height watches from the platform, furious. She's been fighting for civil rights for 30 years at this point. She's organized communities across the country. She's built institutions that will outlast most of the men speaking that day. And she gets to stand silently in the background. 1944. The Civil Rights Act has just passed, but the South is still violently resisting integration. Mississippi is particularly dangerous. Black people trying to register to vote are being beaten, arrested, and killed. Dorothy Height has an idea. She organizes a program called Wednesdays in Mississippi. The concept? Bring interracial groups of women to Mississippi every Wednesday to meet with local women, both black and white, and build bridges across racial lines. It's brilliant, it's risky, it's effective. These women go into the most dangerous parts of Mississippi. They meet with black women who are fighting for their lives to register to vote. They meet with white women who are being taught to hate and fear black people. And slowly they build understanding. Not by giving speeches, not by demanding change from politicians, but by organizing women at the grassroots level. This is Dorothy Height's genius. She understood that lasting change comes from building relationships and creating infrastructure, not from grand gestures. Dorothy Height didn't just fight for racial justice. She fought for black women's economic empowerment. She created job training programs and advocated for equal pay. She fought for reproductive rights. At a time when black women were being forcibly sterilized, she advocated for their right to control their own bodies. She fought for child care and family support programs.
She addressed domestic violence in Black communities. She talked about the specific ways that poverty affected Black women differently than Black men or white women. These weren't popular issues. Civil rights leaders often saw them as distractions from the real work of fighting segregation. White feminists often ignored the specific needs of Black women. Dorothy Height kept fighting. Dorothy Height lived to be 98 years old. In her final years, she finally started receiving some recognition. In 1994, President Bill Clinton awarded her the Presidential Medal of Freedom. In 2004, Congress awarded her the Congressional Gold Medal. But for most of her life, she labored in obscurity. When she died in 2010, President Obama spoke at her funeral. He said she was the godmother of the civil rights movement and a hero to so many Americans. But most Americans had never heard of her until her obituary. Here's the pattern you should be noticing by now. Black women did the essential work of the civil rights movement. They organized, they strategized, they built institutions, they took enormous risks, and they were erased. The men got the credit. The men gave the famous speeches. The men got the awards and the recognition and the place in history books. The women got forgotten. Dorothy Height, Ella Baker, Fannie Lou Hamer, Diane Nash, Septima Clark. These women shaped American history, and most Americans don't know their names. That's not an accident. Before she died, Dorothy Height said this: "We have to work together. Too often we pull apart and waste our time fighting each other, instead of concentrating on the real issues that confront us." She also said, "Without community service, we would not have a strong quality of life. It's important to the person who serves as well as the recipient. It's the way in which we ourselves grow and develop." She spent 98 years living those principles, and history tried to forget her. Now you know their names: Ella Baker, Bayard Rustin, Claudette Colvin, Benjamin Banneker, Dorothy Height. 5 people who changed American history. 5 people whose names don't appear in most textbooks. So now the question is, why? Why were these specific people erased while others were celebrated? The answer is going to make you uncomfortable. Here's what America wants you to believe about the civil rights movement. It was led by peaceful, respectable leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. These leaders gave inspiring speeches. They asked nicely for equality. White people eventually saw the light and decided to grant rights to Black people. It's a nice story. It's comfortable. It lets white people feel good about themselves. And it's a lie. The real civil rights movement was radical. It was militant. It was organized by socialists, communists, gay people, dark-skinned Black people, women, and young people who white America found terrifying. It didn't ask for equality. It demanded it. It didn't wait for white people to change their minds. It forced them to change through economic pressure, legal challenges, and direct action. It wasn't peaceful because Black people are naturally peaceful. It was a strategic choice made by organizers like Bayard Rustin and Ella Baker. And it succeeded not because white people suddenly became less racist, but because the movement made racism too expensive and too embarrassing for America to maintain. That's the real story, and it's been systematically erased from how we teach history. Ella Baker was erased because her philosophy was too radical. She believed in radical democracy. She believed ordinary people should lead movements, not charismatic male leaders. That's terrifying to people in power, because if people learn that they don't need leaders to save them, that they can organize themselves and create change, then the entire power structure is threatened. So instead, we teach about Martin Luther King Jr. as if he single-handedly created the civil rights movement. We make it about one great man, not millions of ordinary people organizing for justice. We make it about speeches, not strategy. And we erase the woman who made it all possible. Bayard Rustin was erased because he was gay, and because he was a socialist, and because he connected the civil rights movement to labor organizing, to anti-war activism, to LGBTQIA rights. America wanted the civil rights movement to be about black people politely asking for inclusion into the existing system. Rustin wanted to transform the entire system. He said the civil rights movement should be about economic justice, not just legal equality. He said it should be about ending capitalism's exploitation of working people. He said it should be about challenging American imperialism. That's too radical for history textbooks. So we remember the March on Washington as the day Martin Luther King Jr. gave a great speech, not as the day a gay socialist organized 250,000 people to demand economic transformation. Claudette Colvin was erased because she didn't fit the image of respectability. She was too young, too dark, too poor, too pregnant. The civil rights movement made a calculated decision. We need a face that white moderates will sympathize with. Rosa Parks fit that description. Claudette Colvin didn't. This is the ugly truth about respectability politics. Even movements for justice internalize oppression. Even black leaders believed that lighter skin, older age, and middle-class respectability would be more effective. They sacrificed a teenage girl's place in history for strategic reasons. And it worked. The Montgomery bus boycott succeeded. But at what cost? What message does it send when we tell young, dark-skinned, poor black girls that they're not good enough to be heroes? Benjamin Banneker was erased because his genius was incompatible with white supremacy. Slavery and segregation depended on the myth that black people were intellectually inferior. Banneker proved that was a lie. A self-taught black man in the 18th century was doing astronomical calculations that rivaled the best scientists in Europe. That couldn't be allowed to stand. So his contributions were minimized, his manuscripts were destroyed, his role in designing Washington, D.C. was written out of history. Because acknowledging Banneker meant acknowledging that slavery wasn't based on natural hierarchy, it was based on violence and greed. Dorothy Height was erased because she was a black woman talking about black women's issues. The civil rights movement was dominated by men who wanted to focus on race, not gender. The feminist movement was dominated by white women who didn't care about racism. Height insisted you couldn't separate the two. She insisted that black women faced unique forms of oppression that required specific solutions. And both movements told her to shut up and focus on their priorities instead. So she got written out of history, along with Ella Baker, Fannie Hoo Hamer, Diane Nash, and countless other black women who did the actual work of organizing the civil rights movement. See the pattern? The people who get erased are too radical, too queer, too black, too female, too young, too poor, too militant, too demanding, too honest about what actually creates change. The people who get remembered are respectable, peaceful, but not pacifist, male, eloquent, willing to work within the system, palatable to white moderates. History isn't written by the winners, it's written by the people who control the narrative. And the narrative they want to tell is one that makes us comfortable. Think about how the civil rights movement is taught in schools. Students learn about Martin Luther King Jr. giving the "I Have a Dream" speech. They learn about Rosa Parks refusing to give up her seat. Maybe they learn about the Little Rock Nine or the Freedom Riders. But they don't learn about the economic philosophy behind the movement, the role of women in organizing, the socialist and communist influences, the connections to labor organizing, the gay people who were essential to its success, the dark-skinned teenagers who weren't respectable enough, the grassroots organizers who built the infrastructure. They learn a sanitized version that suggests racism ended because people asked nicely. And then they wonder why racism still exists. Here's why this matters. When we erase the real organizers of the civil rights movement, we erase the lesson of how change actually happens. We teach young people that they need to wait for a great leader to save them. We teach them that change happens through inspiring speeches, not hard organizing work. We teach them to be respectful and patient, not militant and demanding. We teach them to work within the system, not to challenge itself. And then we wonder why movements today struggle. It's because we erased the people who actually knew how to build movements. Claudette Colvin's erasure teaches us something crucial. Respectability politics doesn't work. The idea that if black people just dress nicely, speak properly, and act respectable, then white people will stop being racist. It's a lie. And it's a lie designed to control black resistance. Claudette Colvin was brave enough, she was courageous enough, she was right enough, but she wasn't respectable enough. So civil rights leaders threw her under the bus, literally, to find someone who was. And what did that accomplish? The movement succeeded. Segregation ended. Rights were won. But the lesson learned was only certain kinds of black people deserved to be celebrated. Only the respectable ones. Only the palatable ones. That's not justice. That's conditional acceptance. Ella Baker, Dorothy Height, and countless other women organized the civil rights movement. They did the unglamorous work. They went door to door. They held meetings. They created infrastructure. They trained leaders. They built coalitions. And men gave speeches and became famous. This pattern repeats throughout history. In every movement, women do the essential labor and men take the credit. Why? Because we've been trained to believe that leadership means standing in front of crowds and giving inspiring speeches. But real leadership is organization, it's strategy, it's the boring, difficult work of building something that lasts. The women did that work, and history forgot them. This is Ella Baker's most important lesson. She didn't believe in the great man theory of history. She didn't believe in waiting for a savior. She believed in developing leadership in ordinary people. She believed in radical democracy. She believed collective action. And she was right. The civil rights movement succeeded not because of Martin Luther King Jr.'s speeches. It succeeded because millions of ordinary people organized, sacrificed, and fought. But we don't teach it that way. We teach it as if King woke up one day, gave a speech, and racism ended. That's not history. That's mythology. And it's dangerous mythology because it teaches people to wait for a leader to become one themselves. Bayard Rustin was erased because he was gay. But here's the truth. Queer people have always been at the forefront of liberation movements. The civil rights movement, the labor movement, the women's movement, every struggle for justice. Queer people have been there, organizing, strategizing, fighting, and they've been systematically erased from those histories. Why? Because acknowledging queer people's contributions means acknowledging that liberation movements are interconnected, that you can't fight racism without fighting homophobia, that you can't fight sexism without fighting transphobia, that all oppression is connected.
And the people in power don't want us to learn that lesson. Claudette Colvin was 15 when she refused to give up her seat. The students who started the sit-in movement were teenagers and young adults. SNCC, the most radical civil rights organization, was run by young people. Young people have always been at the forefront of movements for change. Because they haven't been taught to be cynical yet, they haven't been trained to accept oppression as inevitable. They still believe things can change, and they're willing to risk everything to make it happen. But when we erase young people like Claudette Colvin from history, we send a message. Your courage doesn't matter until you're older and more appropriate. Wait your turn. Be patient. Let the adults handle it. That's how you kill movements before they start. Benjamin Banneker proved something that white supremacy couldn't tolerate. Black intellectual genius has always existed, even under the most oppressive conditions, even without access to formal education, even when white society did everything possible to suppress it. Banneker taught himself advanced mathematics and astronomy. He designed a capital city. He debated with Thomas Jefferson as an intellectual equal. And he did it all while black people were enslaved and denied education across most of America. Imagine what black people could accomplish with equal resources and opportunities. That's what terrifies white supremacy. Not that black people might become equal, but that they might surpass white people entirely. So Banneker's story gets buried. This is the lesson that scares people most. The civil rights movement wasn't just about ending segregation, it was about economic transformation. The March on Washington was called the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. Jobs first, then freedom. Because civil rights leaders understood that legal equality without economic equality is meaningless. What good is the right to eat at any restaurant if you can't afford food? What good is the right to live anywhere if you can't afford housing? What good is the right to vote if economic desperation forces you to support politicians who exploit you? Bayard Rustin understood this. He spent his later years fighting for economic justice. Martin Luther King Jr. understood this. He was assassinated while supporting a sanitation workers' strike. But we don't teach that version of history. We teach that the civil rights movement was about ending legal discrimination, period. Not about ending economic exploitation. Because acknowledging that would mean acknowledging that the fight isn't over. That racism is still deeply connected to economic inequality. That you can't fix one without fixing the other. This is the most important lesson. History isn't objective truth, it's a story told by people with agendas. And the people who write history books have a vested interest in making you believe that change happens gradually and peacefully. You should work within the system. Radical action is dangerous and counterproductive. Great leaders create change, not ordinary people. The current system is basically fine and needs minor adjustments. None of that is true. But if you believe it, you won't challenge the system. You'll wait for permission to be free. You'll accept incremental change instead of demanding transformation. You'll believe that the people currently in power deserve to be there. That's why these 5 people were erased. Not because they weren't important, but because the lessons they taught are too dangerous. The real history of the civil rights movement is this. Ordinary people, especially women, queer people, dark-skinned people, poor people, organized themselves. They built institutions, they developed strategy, they took enormous risks. They didn't wait for permission, they didn't ask nicely, they didn't work within the system. They forced the system to change. Through economic boycotts, through legal challenges, through direct action, through civil disobedience, through constant, relentless organizing. It wasn't peaceful because they were naturally peaceful. It was a strategic choice designed to win public support and avoid giving the government an excuse for violence. But they were ready to defend themselves. They weren't pacifists. They were strategists. And when legal approaches didn't work, they got more militant. That's the real history. And it's been systematically erased because it's a manual for revolution. Everything you just learned about how history was erased, it's happening right now. The same patterns, the same tactics, the same lies. Look at Black Lives Matter. Who organized it? 3 black queer women, Alicia Garza, Patrisse Cullors, and Opal Tomati. And how is it portrayed in the media? As chaotic, leaderless, disorganized. Sound familiar? They're using the same playbook they used on Ella Baker. Erase the black women who did the organizing, focus on male leaders, or frame it as spontaneous chaos. Right now, movements for justice are struggling with the same questions. Should we be respectable or radical? Should we work within the system or challenge it? Should we wait for leaders or organize ourselves? These questions were answered decades ago. By Ella Baker, by Bayard Rustin, by Claudette Colvin, by Benjamin Banneker, by Dorothy Height. But because their stories were erased, every generation has to learn these lessons all over again. That's not an accident. That's on design. Now you know their names: Ella Baker, Bayard Rustin, Claudette Colvin, Benjamin Banneker, Dorothy Height. Now you know their stories. Now you know how history is manipulated. Now you understand the patterns. So what do you do with that knowledge? The first step is simple. Remember them. Say their names. Tell their stories. Refuse to let them be forgotten again. When someone talks about Rosa Parks, mention Claudette Colvin. When someone talks about the March on Washington, mention Bayard Rustin. When someone talks about Martin Luther King Jr., mention Ella Baker. When someone talks about American genius, mention Benjamin Banneker. When someone talks about the civil rights movement, mention Dorothy Height. Keep their memories alive. Question everything you were taught about history. Ask who's missing from this story. Who did the actual work? Who organized? Who took risks? And whose contributions were erased? Usually the answer is women, queer people, young people, dark-skinned people, poor people, radicals. The people who actually created change, but who weren't respectable enough to be remembered. Learn the lessons they taught. Don't wait for a leader to save you. Organize yourself and your community. Don't believe in respectability politics. Justice shouldn't require performing respectability. Don't separate different forms of oppression. Racism, sexism, homophobia, classism, they're all connected. Don't work within systems designed to oppress you. Challenge the system itself. Don't accept incremental change when transformation is necessary. These are the lessons that Ella Baker, Bayard Rustin, Claudette Colvin, Benjamin Banneker, and Dorothy Height taught. And they're still relevant today. Recognize that the same erasure is happening now. Right now, there are people organizing for justice whose names you'll never learn. They're doing the unglamorous work, the difficult work, the dangerous work. And when change happens, other people will take the credit. Don't let that happen. Amplify their voices, share their work, give them credit. Make sure the next generation doesn't have to rediscover the same heroes we forgot. Here's the truth about how change actually happens. It's not inspirational speeches. It's not waiting for the right leader. It's not asking nicely. It's ordinary people organizing themselves, building infrastructure, creating strategy, taking action. It's women doing the invisible labor that makes movements possible. It's queer people connecting different struggles. It's young people refusing to accept the world as it is. It's dark-skinned, poor, inappropriate people demanding justice without performing respectability. It's radicals pushing the boundaries of what's possible. That's how change happens, and that's why those stories are erased. The fight that Ella Baker, Bayard Rustin, Claudette Colvin, Benjamin Banneker, and Dorothy Height dedicated their lives to, it's not over. Racism still exists, economic inequality still exists, sexism still exists, homophobia still exists.
The systems they fought against have adapted. They've become more subtle, more insidious, but they haven't gone away.
And the strategies they developed, grassroots organizing, economic pressure, direct action, radical democracy, are still the most effective tools we have. Their fight is our fight. Their struggle is our struggle. Their erasure from history was meant to make us forget how to fight. Now you remember. You've learned about 5 people whose names should be as famous as Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King Jr., or Malcolm X. But they're not. And that's not because they weren't important enough. It's because the truth they represented was too dangerous. Ella Baker proved that movements don't need charismatic male leaders. Bayard Rustin proved that queer people and socialists are essential to liberation. Claudette Colvin proved that respectability politics is a trap. Benjamin Banneker proved that black genius exists independent of white approval. Dorothy Height proved that black women's issues can't be separated from broader justice movements. These truths challenge the fundamental narratives that America tells itself. So these people were erased. Here's the question you should be asking right now. If they erased these 5 people, who else did they erase? How many other heroes are lost to history? How many other organizers, strategists, and revolutionaries have been forgotten? How many other truths have been buried? The answer is thousands, tens of thousands. Every movement for justice has unsung heroes whose names we'll never know, because history is written by the powerful, and the powerful don't want you to know how to challenge them. Now you have a choice. You can forget what you just learned, you can go back to accepting the sanitized version of history, you can pretend that change happens gradually and peacefully through asking nicely. That's the comfortable choice. Or you can remember. You can question everything you've been taught. You can look for the people who've been erased. You can learn from their strategies. You can organize like Ella Baker. You can build coalitions like Bayard Rustin. You can have courage like Claudette Colvin. You can demand recognition for black genius like Benjamin Banneker. You can fight for intersectional justice like Dorothy Height. That's the uncomfortable choice. But it's the only choice that leads to real change. The people in power are afraid of what you just learned. They're afraid you'll realize that change doesn't come from asking permission. They're afraid you'll realize that ordinary people have the power to transform society. They're afraid you'll realize that the current system isn't inevitable or natural. It was created by people and can be changed by people. They're afraid you'll organize. That's why they erased Ella Baker, Bayard Rustin, Claudette Colvin, Benjamin Banneker, and Dorothy Height. Not to insult them, but to prevent you from learning what they knew. But here's the thing about truth. You can bury it, you can hide it, you can erase it from textbooks and exclude it from monuments. But you can't kill it. Because truth lives in the people who remember, in the stories that get passed down, in the organizing traditions that continue. Ella Baker's philosophy of grassroots organizing still guides movements today. Bayard Rustin's strategies for building coalitions still work. Claudette Colvin's courage still inspires teenagers to stand up for justice. Benjamin Banneker's genius still proves that oppression can't suppress human brilliance. Dorothy Height's intersectional approach still shapes how we think about justice. They're not erased. They're just waiting to be remembered. So here's what you do now. 1. Share this story. Tell people about these 5 heroes. Don't let them be forgotten again. 2. Question the history you were taught. Look for the people who were erased. Find the uncomfortable truths that challenge the narrative. 3. Learn from their strategies. Study how they organized. Understand how they built movements. Apply their lessons to the struggles of today. 4. Organize. Don't wait for a leader. Don't ask for permission. Build power with the people around you. 5. Remember that change is possible. These 5 people helped transform America. They faced impossible odds, they risked everything, and they won. You can too. Ella Baker said, "We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes." Bayard Rustin said, "The only weapon we have is our bodies, and we need to tuck them in places so that wheels don't turn." Claudette Colvin said, "History had me glued to the seat." Benjamin Banneker wrote, "I suppose it is a truth too well attested to you to need a proof here, that we are a race of beings who have long labored under the abuse and censure of the world." Dorothy Height said, "Without community service, we would not have a strong quality of life." These are the words of people who refused to accept injustice. People who organized, fought, and sacrificed. People who changed the world. People who were erased from history because the truths they represented were too dangerous. But now you know their names. Now you know their stories. Now you know how history is manipulated. And knowledge is power. The most important thing you learn today isn't the story of 5 forgotten heroes. It's this: history is a lie told by the powerful to keep you from challenging their power. Every story you were taught was carefully selected to make you believe that change is slow, that revolution is impossible, that you need to wait for someone to save you. But the truth is, change is possible, revolution is necessary, and you don't need anyone to save you. Because you have the same power that Ella Baker, Bayard Rustin, Claudette Colvin, Benjamin Banneker, and Dorothy Height had. The power to organize, to resist, to transform. The power to change the world. They tried to erase that knowledge, but now you have it back. Don't let them take it again. Remember their names, tell their stories, and continue their fight. Because the struggle for justice doesn't end with learning history. It begins there.